Wonderful. Thank you. Over to you, Billy.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Brian A, Eleanor, Laura, Cara, and Zoe from the Open University Press. So in today's virtual book launch, our aim is really to take you with us on a journey of how we went about doing our research on the ideal students. And we've included a quick online activity that we encourage you to take part. And we will use that as a way to give you an overview of the book, including the key implications and takeaway messages. So let me just quickly share my screen. I just want to say before we begin that writing a book is never easy for us anyway. And there are lots of people who have supported us along the way, both formally and informally. So thank you from the both of us, especially those mentioned in our acknowledgements, but also the very nice endorsements that we got from colleagues who we highly respect. So that would include Louise Archer, Richard Reyes, fan of Frank Su, Jill Crozier, Rachel Brooks, and Lars Ulrichsen. So Tiffany and I will alternate and talk for around 30 minutes. And as Brian has said already, we're delighted to have our fantastic colleagues, Emily and Freddie, who will talk for around 5 minutes each on their thoughts around our work. The final part is the Q&A. So again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to make a submission. And if your questions are answered in the book, we will let you know. So I want to start with a story of how this book emerged. I'm assuming you can still see my share screen. So this is our project website. So the ideas for the ideal student researched emerged through our own experiences of teaching. And Tiffany and I did a lot of teaching with very diverse range of students. So before my current role at Reading, I was teaching undergraduates at the University of Roehampton for almost 5 years. And the students we had there came from a wide range of backgrounds, including commuter students, minority ethnic students, mature students, students with parenting responsibilities, and students who entered higher education from different qualification routes, so not just A-level. And likewise for Tiffany, before starting at Imperial, Tiffany was teaching at St. Patrick's College and the University of East London, which again were attended by students from very diverse backgrounds. And we experienced firsthand that when students start their university degrees with different educational experiences and background, there will be different expectations and ways of making sense of how higher education works. And in practice, as teaching staff, we all have our own expectations about what higher education is about. And when our students are quite diverse, there is a need for us to spell out these expectations. And this is relevant for both the majority as well as the minority student population, wherever these may be. So for example, as a teacher, I might assume that in a lecture theater, it is common knowledge that students will turn off their mobile phones or have it on silent. Or in preparation for a seminar or a tutorial, I may expect my students to have done their assigned reading. Or in focus groups, in discussion groups, I may assume that it is normal for everyone to feel comfortable in sharing their views openly, even if there are different views from other people. Now, some of these assumptions may be obvious or even taken for granted from the perspective of the teacher. But this assumption is based on what we think are normal and expected. And we really should not be making those assumptions. It is important, even if it seems obvious to us, because it might not be obvious for others. And we can't afford to be too self-centered in projecting our views of the world and expect everyone else to subscribe to that viewpoint. So the beginnings of the ideal student research started back in 2014, when I was completing a program that allowed me to gain fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. And I designed a small-scale teaching-related project, just trying to understand how similar or different are staff and students in relation to what they ideally expect from an undergraduate student. And that was probably the first time I used the term ideal student as a concept to start thinking about these desirable expectations. Now, afterwards, I started doing more research in the higher education context, and from 2015 onwards, I was doing pilot studies to better understand the academic success of students from underrepresented backgrounds. And I started working with Tiffany so we can broaden our scope, especially when we had limited resources. So we collected more research data and began exploring the views and experiences of both staff and students. And then we wrote some research papers. And in 2017, we were successful in a small research grant from the British Academy, which led to the 2-year Ideal Student Project. Now, the project includes student focus groups and the questionnaire, exploring the concept as well as the content of the ideal student. And near the end of the project in August 2019, we began writing the book. And thankfully, more than half of the book was drafted when the pandemic hit in March last year. But anyway, here we are. So the book is out in paperback, and I'm very grateful for that. And it has been quite a journey. But rather than me talking about the research theories and the methods, we thought it would be quite interesting and interactive if we invite you, everyone in the audience, to experience a little bit about how we went about collecting our data. So here we have a Mentimeter that we would like to invite you to take part. We want to know, what are your most important or desirable features of a student in higher education? So the task is simple. If you go to this website, menti.com, and enter those 8-digit numbers, or click on the link in the chat, which I believe Tiffany has entered, you should be taken to a website that asks you to enter up to 3 keywords of your own ideal students. And this is a simplified version of what we did, and it will still be very interesting, we think, to see what characteristics are important for you. So you should be taken to a website that looks like this. So please do share your views. So in our project, as I said, we asked a very similar question, and we used that as a way to generate ideas and discussions. And we stress that there are no right or wrong answers, because these are just based on your own experiences and ideas. And we did this activity as a focus group, and we asked participants for up to 5 characteristics, both desirable and undesirable, which they later elaborated in the discussion. So just a few more seconds, and don't worry if you're not complete. As long as you have the link open, you can always share your view, and we will come back to this a little later. So I just want to say that our book has 9 chapters and 3 appendix, and the appendix covers further details of the methodologies and the data analysis, and I highly recommend Appendix 1. So Chapter 1 basically sets out the background and why we think the research is important. And I think you can read that online as a preview on one of the biggest book websites. Chapter 2 focuses on the literature and existing studies, as well as the theories and the research that informed our thinking. And again, you can read a bit more about that in the book. But what I want to do now is to pass it on to Tiffany, who will give us an overview of Chapter 3. And I will come back to the Mentimeter activity when I talk about Chapter 4 to 7. But over to Tiffany now.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see it? Lovely. So, okay, thank you, Billy. So in Chapter 3, we explored how the concept of the ideal student is understood and recognized by university staff and students, and including its conceptual challenges as well as possibilities. So what do we mean by ideal? So by ideal students, we do not mean being perfect or the best. Here we draw on Max Weber, who consider ideal as a mental construct that can be used to comprehend, to analyze, and to make comparison with the social reality. And this is based on the premise that every social actions often has an ideal or an expectation due to the social and the cultural conventions, and which can also be developed over time and experiences. So for instance, we probably all have some expectations or ideas about what an ideal book launch is. So for me, the ideal book launch would be in a face-to-face setting with wine, champagne, or other refreshments. So unlike right now, so we all do this remotely. And if it's in a face-to-face setting, we also get to socialize with each other and see people in person. And of course, you might have different ideals in terms of what you think about this. And this would be based on our expectations, our experiences, our communities, but also our preferences. So in the context of higher education, an ideal student will entail the desirable characteristics of students at the university. And here, an important point to make is that the ideal types are not meant to be a direct reflection of the specific individuals with particular attributes. Instead, it constitutes a shared recognition of the various features that we might be able to find across a range of students. And all ideals, we argue, serve the same function, which is to make transparent and explicit expectations. So as Billy mentioned earlier, writing this topic is quite a challenge as we were operating with an abstract concept on what ideal student means in the context of higher education. And we also recognize that in practice and in everyday life, the term ideal student can trigger a range of assumptions. Okay, so if we ask you, what do you think about the concept of the ideal student? What would you say? Okay, so given the time limit here, we probably wouldn't ask you to share your thoughts at this point, but we are sure that when you first come across our book title, The Ideal Students, you probably might say it is very subjective as this depends on each individual, okay? And there is no such thing as an ideal student. Okay, or you might say it is not reality to be that ideal. And some people might also raise concerns over the rigidity and the hierarchy given an explicit list could limit for others, and people might just all end up in the same way. Okay, so indeed, a few of our participants admitted they are holding this degree of uncertainty about the meanings or implications of the concept itself when they were first invited to our research. And with these multiple interpretations and constructions of ideals, our participants are concerned that there is not a singular understanding. And they also raise issues in relation to this achievability of the concept of ideal, and more specifically, the ideal student identity. So some staff stated that we have to be real with our students about our expectations. And our students also emphasized that it is really difficult to have all these aspects at once. And as we anticipated, some participants at least initially associate with the ideal with the word perfect. Okay, so which is understandable given the dictionary definitions often consider these words as synonymous. And these accounts have implied that ideal student can be unrealistic and ironically not ideal per se. Okay. So while there are conceptual challenges, we also identify the potentials of the concept, and this is something we would like to focus on. So the relationship between the ideal and perfect has been disputed by some participants in later discussion. So one staff member said, the ideal student is the one we see as progressing and not already perfect. So here, the ideal students will actually include making progress and also having room for improvement. And given these, we argue that the ideal student is not the same as the perfect student, and we need to disentangle these two terms. And the concept of ideal students also needs to be contextualized. So for example, one student stated what is ideal shifts according to who we are being taught, and another said it actually varies from where you are and the institutions you are in. Okay. And our participants also discussed the importance of being explicit and dangerous around the presumptions. So one staff member said that I think students do increasingly need more explicit guidelines, and we shouldn't assume they know that. Similarly, students also suggest lecturers could say at the very beginning of the year, this is what the ideal student did last year, and this is what we expected of you. So if you want to be that ideal students, then if you want, you can push yourself and be that ideal student, and students can do what the criteria said if they want. So here, whether or not the students could or should aspire or develop to be an ideal student will probably require other research and need deeper discussion. But the premise is that the expectations of university students should be made transparent and should be made explicit. And most importantly, it needs to be realistic. So the concept of ideal students provide a space for discussions and negotiation. And in fact, many of our participants mentions that they haven't actually used the term ideal at all, but at the end of the focus group, most of them felt that the discussion has provided them with fruitful thoughts and have a greater appreciation of the fluidity and the potential of the concept. So the initial concerns or rejections of the concept of the ideal students can be mitigated through the deeper discussion and self-reflections. And during the process of writing this topic, we kind of move back and forth to fine-tune our arguments and consider which position we should take. And after thinking about the challenges as well as the potentials, we believe the danger of an implicit approach, this approach can be worse, as unspoken assumptions and expectations of students can offer limited guidance to develop as university students, especially for those who are less familiar with the learning and practices in higher education. So we see the concept of ideal student has more potentials than the challenges. So this can be seen as a kind of thinking tools to better understand the expectations and experiences of university students, which we believe is central to the inclusive learning and teaching practice. So the concept of ideal can offer students an opportunity to situate, to reflect, and to negotiate the features that are considered to be desirable in a university student. So here is our working definition based on all this empirical data. So the ideal students constitute the desirable but realistic expectations of students in higher education. And ideal is not about perfection, nor being a highest or the best. So now I will hand it back to Billy, who will talk about the chapters 4 to 7. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Tiffany. So to appreciate how we approach chapters 4 onwards, I suppose, let's go back to the Mentimeter. So these are the keywords that are coming in, and we have quite a range, and we've included some previous ones from our students. So just from a glance here, we can see that motivated, enthusiastic, organized, hardworking, passionate. Those are the keywords which are popping up, and there are lots and lots of ideas. There are smaller words which you may not be able to see. So lots of potentially different forms of ideal attributes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did a fairly similar activity in our own research, but we did it in focus groups. So in total for this research, we conducted 33 focus groups with 132 students and staff. And each participant was asked to write down top 5 most important and least important features in a student. And in total, we collected 795 keywords. And the majority of these keywords were discussed and expanded in the discussion. So we have a much richer understanding of what these actually mean, especially since a lot of these words and the intended meanings can overlap. So using these keywords as well as the literature, we created the Ideal Student Survey, which ended up being made of 50 items of student characteristics. And we wrote that extensively in chapter 4 of the book. It is the longest chapter, 15,000 words, but we really want to show the nuances and the data which informed our decisions and the construction of these items. As I said, there are overlaps, and we also had to be pragmatic because we want the survey to be short and easy to complete. But the items and the characteristics in the surveys are almost intended to be a starting point in promoting conversations about expectations of students. So we see almost like a stimulus for discussion about our different ideals. Now, the version that we created takes around 5 to 10 minutes to complete, and we collected over 1,000 responses from students and staff, where participants rated from 1 to 5 in terms of the relative importance for those 50 items. So with the help of a colleague, Jen DeWitch, who I believe is in the audience today, our consultant, we used exploratory factor analysis and ended up with these 8 tentative dimensions of the ideal student, which is currently listed by their relative importance. And we use that as a basis for discussion in later chapters when we make reference to the questionnaire results. Jumping on, in chapter 5, our focus was more on the similarities and differences between the views of staff and students. And we used both the questionnaire as well as the focus groups as our data to unpack their expectations of the ideal student. So we have a section on how staff describes the ideal student, how students themselves describe the ideal student, and also what students think staff expect of them. Chapter 6, we focused on differences between university type and discipline. And this is not meant to be a comprehensive thing, but just illustrative of how constructions of the ideal students might differ by these variables. So for university type, we focused on pre-92 and post-92 universities. Now, of course, each university has its own values and ways of working, but in the UK, pre-92 universities are typically associated with those who are more research focused, whilst post-92 typically seen as more teaching oriented. And basically we explored if there was any differences between the construction of the ideal student by participants from these different university types. Now we also looked at differences by discipline, and we used STEM and SHAPE as the acronyms, as well as the broader groupings of natural sciences, applied sciences, social sciences, and arts and humanities. Again, as a way to separate, but also bring together these supposedly similar subjects. We included a discussion on disciplinary difference in a chapter, but we think there's a lot more potential for further work here. And I know Andrea Gregersen from Denmark has recently wrote about the ideal philosophy students. It will be fascinating to see how these disciplines and the ideals they have may be specific to particular subjects or not. And in our current work, we're also looking deeper into the ideal student in STEM, with a focus on specific disciplines. So again, plenty of opportunities for further research. And we've got some ideas for our website. So if you're good with it, let us know. I'm also thinking about going global with the research, but we just need some funding. So chapter 7 then, before I pass back to Tiffany, we looked into social identities. So we're focusing on gender, social class, ethnicity, and age. And the question we ask ourselves is the ideal student gendered, racialized, classed, or age? And we looked at this in 2 ways. We looked at it using the questionnaire, which focused on participants' own demographic data and what they responded, but we also used the focus group data to see what participants say or think about the influences of these social identities. So chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 use data from the questionnaire and the focus group. And the aim really is to highlight the different ways of making sense about who the ideal student is and how different roles and positions can shape these ideal student characteristics. For example, between staff and students, between institutions, between disciplines, and the influence of different social identities. But overall, we map these 8 dimensions of the ideal student. And in particular, we noted the importance of diligence right at the top over intelligence, which is right at the bottom. But I will now hand back to Tiffany to conclude our part of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Billy. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see it. Yeah, okay, excellent. So in chapter 8, our focus is on being identified as an ideal student, either by students themselves or by others. As indicated by the chapter title, Is the Ideal Student Me? So we examine the difficulties, dilemmas, and the pressures for students to claim or associate with this identity or not. And we begin by comparing the ideal student with a similar but quite different and more intelligible identity of good student, as we aim to further our understanding of student identities in higher education. So we compare how students identify with the good students and the ideal student. In this chapter, we also consider the role of external factors with the ideal students, and these factors appears to have shaped the way students associate or think about this concept. So for example, some factors such as students' prior cultural and educational experiences, the demands of the subject and curriculum, and the lecturers' expectations, and so on. So our takeaway message is that the concept of the ideal students provides a concrete frame of reference where different expectations of students can be mapped out for discussion and for negotiation. In chapter 9, which is our concluding chapter, and we consider the meanings and implications of our research for theories and practice. And we begin with a brief but critical reflections on the ideal student study. And we revisited the key concerns and possibilities of the concept and discussed the potential of the ideal student concept to support the development of the graduate attributes. We then focus on the applications of the concept as we make practical suggestions for teaching and learning and curriculum design and pedagogical development. We include examples of how the concept of ideal students can be applied in practice with the details and the reflections on the use of ideal student survey. So I won't say too much more about this because Freddie will talk about how the use of the ideal student surveys, how he has adopted this to support student transition during the inductions as well as progression. So now I think we hope our work has planted the seeds for the concept of the ideal student to grow and to flourish. But first of all, I'm very happy to welcome our colleague, Dr. Emily Dawson, as our first speaker. So Billy and I know Emily from our times at King's College London, where we did our PhDs. So over to you, Emily. I'm gonna start sharing my screen.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, Billy. Thank you for having me. I will share my screen. And so give me a thumbs up if you can see that all perfectly. So thanks for having me. It's my very great joy to be here and celebrating this book that Billy and Tiffany have put out into the world. And it's amazing. I'm always so impressed by their work and the rigor and how important and interesting these books are. And I suppose what I wanted to start with today was, how this book might fit into the lives of those of us who are working and teaching in higher education today. And this has been a strange couple of years in universities. So we've seen really rapid changes in teaching in the context, the practices and the infrastructure around teaching. We've also, I've only met students online this whole year. I haven't seen a single one of my students in person. And in my university, we've seen quite a significant shift in student numbers, both higher and lower than expected. And then there are, of course, beyond that, the long-term trends in how higher education is shifting, both in the policy context, in practice, and in student cohorts. And that's where I think Tiffany and Billy's work starts to become really fascinating. So I wanted, if you can bear with me at lunchtime, I wanted to tell you a bit of a story, and I've written it out so I get it clear. And I suppose I'm trying to use the story to give an example of why I think this book is both really timely and important. So, imagine for me, if you will, a meeting. It is online, of course, between students, staff, and student union officers. And it's happening last summer, shortly after the wave of international Black Lives Matter protests. Everyone in the room is completely exhausted, and it's the end of the summer term. So the staff in the room are exhausted from the intensification of work brought about by the pandemic and all the attendant insecurities that have cropped up as a result. So questions like, will we have jobs in September? Will we have students in September? If we do, how on earth will all of that work? How will we cope? How will we navigate it? And imagine too the students who are just as exhausted and uncertain, but they're propelled by wanting to have an open conversation about inclusive change within their institution. And so this is motivated enough that they've been prepared to stick their necks out and call for a meeting with staff to discuss their concerns about inclusive practice and what could be improved. So imagine then the student union officer patiently explaining that the language of the, quote, BME award gap, and BMA's institutional shorthand, and it means Black and minority ethnic students, that the BME award gap has been changed to place the emphasis on institutional failings rather than student failings, and is now called the awarding gap, and that they anyway also don't find the language of BME groups particularly useful. So all the people in this room see a really different piece of the picture, and all the people in this room are really motivated and inspired and passionate about student experiences and what the potential of higher education can be. And higher education is, of course, a highly ritualized, status-oriented space where the foundations are built on really unequal structural inequalities that persist well into today. And this is, of course, a space that, as I'm sure many of you will know, is really hard to change. So what I really appreciate about Billy and Tiffany working through this concept of the ideal student with such grace and rigor and intellectual capacity is I think it gives us a really useful tool to start to use in the kind of work that is involved in rethinking and dismantling and then rebuilding higher education. So for instance, when we think about questions like, how is it that there can be an awarding gap held across so many British higher education institutions that is so evidently racialized when many procedures are in place, much staff training is in place, and it's these implicit and unmentioned tacit biases that start to creep in to how we develop our teaching practices and how we treat and support students. So here is some joyful praise. The book, as you will have realized by now, examines the mismatches between student and staff expectations. And I think it's crucial for the contemporary context. How do we think about inequalities of experience, inequalities of outcome? And for instance, in the present moment, how will that have been shifted or exacerbated depending on the kinds of infrastructure being rolled out through the pandemic and students' own experiences of the pandemic? So for instance, I had students who were ill, students who lost relatives, immediate members of their family. We had staff who were extremely ill. We had staff who died. We had students with a large number of exceptional circumstances and required a lot of changes to assessment. And these all felt like extremely pressured interactions that were all mediated through an online space. So the kinds of tacit and unacknowledged pieces at work there, I think, are really crucial to pull out. I thought Tiffany and Billy's work was fantastic because it was a constructive interrogation of HE. And it's very easy to fall into what I read recently described as despair sociology. And they don't do that. They have a really constructive approach that I think is really useful. This perhaps goes without saying, but I do read a few books. And this is a lively and fascinating read. I found it a really enjoyable read. So if that's not a good enough reason to pack it into your holiday bags, if we ever get holidays, then I think you should be doing it. To me, the concept was really valuable because we can think about the vast inequalities of student experience in higher education and turn our attention then to those tacit hidden assumptions that haunt universities and will continue to haunt universities until we do this work of thinking about what they are. The clearer we can be about what's going on, the more we can reconsider our own practices and the better we can support students. So I'm thinking here in terms of questions about, what is the game that we're playing? How might we change that game? What are the implications of that game for the different people involved? How do we help students learn the rules? And then how do we change those rules to better support students? Now, this is clearly just one piece of the puzzle in terms of challenging and transforming the profound inequalities at play within higher education, but it is a crucial and timely piece of that puzzle. And it is an enormous contribution to research on critical pedagogy, and one that I'm really delighted to celebrate in this book launch today. These were, I threatened I'd draw hearts around their faces, and I haven't, in an act of enormous maturity. So let me finish by saying that I think Billy and Tiffany are inspiring and insightful leaders in research on higher education and inequalities, and their critical and constructive reflections on student and staff expectations and those mismatches offer us important lessons about what inclusive in practice in higher education requires. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think that is so lovely. Thank you for your lovely words. And then, yeah, it's so great to hear from you in terms of what you think about our work. So it's lovely. So I think now, we are gonna pass on to Freddie, right? So Freddie, over to you.
I think you're on mute, Freddie.
I am muted, yes. I shared my screen and then all my controls dropped, so I wasn't sure how to how to say anything. But anyway, let me. There we go. I think we're all here now, so apologies for that. So yeah, I'd like to give a mini presentation about a practical implementation of the research and ideas of Billy and Tiffany that Tiffany and I implemented in my department at Imperial. So I'm Freddie Page. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Dyson School of Design Engineering at Imperial. So we're an engineering department, but with a focus on design engineering. And for a number of years, I've been the first year coordinator. So part of my role has been to induct and onboard new first year students that, straight from A-level, straight out of school into higher education, into their design engineering degree. So the research and work, the ideal students has been actually great for us to use here as an activity to get students reflecting on their own progression and their own approach to higher education. So yeah, I'll just whiz through what we did and what that looked like. So this is a presentation that usually Tiffany and I give together, but it's going to be condensed down today for the 5 or so minutes that I've got. Because Tiffany was instrumental in, of course, helping me not only having the ideas for the sessions, but assisting me running them as well. So the two of us double teamed in this activity. So yeah, I guess a bit about the context. I've got first year students and they've come straight out of school, and the main thing that they know about is that they've passed exams, and they're quite good at passing exams, and they're used to working in that mode, which is actually quite a solitary and individual mode, where their successes are their own and not shared, and to a certain degree competing against each other. But that's that's not what the real world looks like. You don't find a lot of exams out there in the wild. And whereas you still find a few in university degrees, in our degree, we still have them, but relatively fewer than other departments. We wanted to break the students out of the mindset that this is how to go. For example, our degree, we have a lot of make and build activities. In this one, the students are making a model that they've simulated on the computer, but now they're building it of a Mars landing pad that a rocket or a bowl of water is going to land on, made out of plastic tubes. So, we want them to integrate and link the ideas from the program all around, rather than just studying for the end goal. We want a holistic experience for the students. So we've used the Ideal Student tool. So yeah, this is the, a previous iteration of the project website. I think on Billy's slides, you've seen it updated now. And essentially we did an activity in the final hour of our induction week activity for the students. So after they've been told where everything is and what's going to be happening in the year, we wanted to explore right from the start their attitudes and approaches to higher education. So the first thing we did was we got them to fill in the longer form survey that Billy and Tiffany talked about, where it presented the list of the potential qualities of an ideal student that they had the opportunity to rate, to rank as to which ones spoke to them most, which ones they felt were important. And this was the only priming that we gave them. We didn't talk about what we thought might be the right answer. We discussed it later, but we wanted them to come in kind of without having otherwise been influence. So they got to see this list first. They got to rank, or sorry, not rank, rate those as to what they thought was important. And then from there, so that's this step one part. And this has been in previous years where we got to do this in person. Last year we did it online, but we got the students then to, in small groups, discuss between themselves what they thought was important and what others in their group thought were important features of the students. And then, very much as you've seen, as Billy asked you to do and it was on the slides, we got them to fill out the Mentimeter to put up on there what, what based on their own personal reflections and their group reflections they thought. And that allowed us to go into a whole class discussion where we could unpick some of the ideas. So let me show you what our students got. So you get a few memes, like you get loves James Dyson, which is a popular one for my department, and then we get some emoji as well. But beneath that, you know, we get things that you might expect, like hardworking, but it's also good to see things like being creative and curious, as well as teamwork and communication. So we were able to hone in on each of these and have a bit of a discussion. We asked the students if anyone put that on the screen, if anyone would like to motivate why, or if they had views about it, if anything that they've seen particularly spoke to them. Much like, I think as Billy said earlier, we wanted to see what the students thought of themselves, but we also wanted them to see if they could put themselves in the staff picture and what we expected of them. So we asked them that question as well, and this is the students' answers to that, what they think the tutors think are the important qualities. And it was interesting to see things like being punctual and punctuality coming up as a main, well, as one of the main ideas, but also one of the main differences previously. But also things like time management and willingness to learn. So a slightly different picture than what they themselves thought, which I thought was quite interesting. But we also were able to show them what our staff said, because I asked this question to our faculty in the department, and as to what their thought the features was. And for me, it was interesting that this was a lot more close to what the students thought of themselves than what they thought the tutors would think. So, things like creativity and curiosity. There's a few small things like being bright and being intelligent, but for me, I was really pleased to see the things that the students are in control of, that the students can change, and that's how we tried to reinforce this, that this is modeling good behavior as a reflective exercise, and saying that the ideal student, as Tiffany's mentioned, isn't just one thing, but perhaps is a projection of the idealized version of themselves that they can aspire to be, that they can see which features work for them, and see that this is a direction that they can point themselves in. We spoke about growth mindset and be like, hey, you can be this ideal student, and you should find out the path yourself as to how to get there. Like I think Billy and Tiffany said in their slides, there was you can get differences in different departments. So this is actually one of Tiffany's slides where she ran the same session following our pilot in the biology department, and they got again a slightly different set of qualities coming up as being important to the students, and a slightly different set of emoji as well, which I thought was quite fun too. But then to close off the session that we did in design engineering, we then related it to a slide that I stole from the careers service, which was about what employers consider. And we wanted to highlight the fact that the degree classification, whereas it was important, was perhaps less important to employers than the attitudes and aptitudes for work. So the kind of features that they had ranked as important, we really wanted to show that, hey, this is something well to consider, and it is what employers like, to try and break the pattern of our students just focusing on their exam results, because that is a tangible metric that they have, so it is very easy for them to fall into that trap, whereas we want them to have a more holistic view of the whole program. And also a more relaxed view. We want them to give them the permission to have a healthy work-life balance and get enough sleep. So I think setting that framework and expectation at the start was really helpful. We rounded this session off with our program level learning outcomes so they could see how it all fits in to the bigger picture. And then yeah, we left the students with for that session, because this is the first week. So there's a lot of stuff that it can be quite overwhelming in one way, in one year and out the other. But we hope that some of it did indeed land. But we did in fact pick this up in a second session in the second term to see what their reflections still were, and to reinforce this thinking and essentially protect against falling back into the trap of going hard on exams. And so, yeah, I think this has been a really good developmental tool for our students, and was really pleased to be able to collaborate with Tiffany and use Billy and Tiffany's work in the Ideal students to bring this forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Freddie. I think that is great. And yeah, I think Eleanor might have collected some questions that people would like to ask the panel.
Yeah, so just to introduce myself quickly, I'm the editor for the education list here at Open University Press. And yeah, I'm really excited to ask some questions. And I mean, it'll be a bit of a hard job to follow up on all the great stuff that's been talked about so far. But the first question, I think actually links quite well with what Freddie was talking about, because obviously he was talking initially about how you open the year and get people thinking about what kind of student they are. But how do you direct your students who are maybe not so much like ideal, or maybe don't see themselves, like how do they ask for help maybe further down the line, and how do you kind of continue that conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so we have our personal tutor system where every student has a personal tutor who will see about 5 students in their year group, and they can have the opportunity for the regular one-on-one chats. But I think getting the staff on board as well. So we did this survey with our staff members for them to see what the students thought, and for them to get their views out as well, so that we could prime our staff on having that diversity of views, so that the colleagues who wrote answers, and there were a few of these on the slide if you caught it, like being bright and intelligent, which is cool, but it is perhaps less. You're less able to. It's less easy to see how you can change that directly. Whereas some of the other ones, we want to be able to say, actually, these are things you can work on. So we wanted to, I guess, both have the students have the opportunity to discuss with their academic mentor, with their staff member, about their progression, but also prime the staff into what they should look for based on these ideal qualities. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Billy, you want to say something first?
Okay, I'll say, and I might just say what you're going to say anyway. I think as a staff or as a teachers, I think it's important we just be very clear about what we expect. Now, we can't force students to be what we want them to be, but what we could do is to list out what, based on our experiences, what kind of attributes do we value in higher education students. Now, the question around asking for help is actually very interesting. We wrote a paper on that, and I think in a conversation I had with Tiffany, she was telling me how in one of these interaction activities that we did on the Mentimeter, one of the phrases that students actually put in, or staff put in, is actually asking for help. So asking for help is characteristics of an ideal student, students who are open and willing to accept that they have progress to make, they can ask for help. And being explicit is almost give the license for people to do some stuff, whether it's been assumed that actually, I don't know if I should or could ask for help, but being explicit, stating actually, as far as I'm concerned, and I think a lot of our colleagues will think the same, I will appreciate a lot if students, if they're stuck, they will email me, ask me questions, rather than taking it all on themselves and thinking that, okay, I can't ask or I can't seek for support. I just have to go off and do what I think is the right thing to do. But yeah, so long story short, asking for help, for me anyway, is actually a very desirable characteristic, because it shows that they're open to learn, and that's what students are learners.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little bit to what Billy said. So in higher education, I think when the student come in and then when they start their journey, usually we would like students to develop this independent learner identity. And for some reason, I think a lot of students seems to think, asking for help contradicts with this particular identity, because they think they're meant to be independent. But the thing is, they need to know where and when they need help. So instead of stucking at one point, they need to know when to stop this and really to seek support. So in the induction, when we did this induction activities using the ideal student survey, so Freddie and I basically we highlight this. So we try to normalize asking for help is one of the key attributes, and it's an essential attributes that student needs to have as part of their independent learner identity. So these two things don't actually contradict, but they work hand in hand together.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely about sort of that longer term development of their identity, and it's not sort of just a one-off intervention. So continuing the conversation. So another question that's come in, which I think also links to that idea about identity, is what impact do you think the pandemic might have on year one students about their conceptualization of the ideal student? Obviously, they've had quite an unusual last 2 years of school, so their learner identity is a bit different from previously.
I will kick off, and then obviously the rest of the panel members are more than welcome to join in. I mean, I think it depends on how long the pandemic is going to last, isn't it? If we are towards the end of the road, at least in England, policy-wise, one thing which obviously that we have got used to a lot is digital learning and online learning. And that's one of the things we wrote at the end of the book, really, is to reflect actually because of what happened in the last 16 months. Will the emphasis around digital learning, digital competency, digital literacy becomes much higher up in terms of how students and staff interact, and whether those skills are more valued than ever was. So I think for the year one students, or even the next year one versions, they will probably think, or they're thinking of the ideal student will be more digitalized or hybrid, how to access online resources. And we don't know yet, but I think there will definitely be a stronger emphasis around digital learning and the use of digital platforms. But that's just my quick 2 pence.
For me, I found one of the biggest difficulties is the first years didn't really know each other. So whereas they're in a virtual room with each other, they can't normalize the experience. And I think that's been one of the real difficulties. So being able to kind of normalize what they think an ideal student is, or what they think about the experience themselves, coming out of an exam and being able to say, was that difficult? And the other people being like, yeah, rather than just being like, yep, no, it was all fine. I think that communication, the kind of like cooperative learning is really important and has been really difficult and missing this year, I feel.
Yeah, and I also have some thoughts about this. And I think in one of our chapters, when we ask students to kind of rate the relative importance of those attributes, and so apart from, in addition to that, we also have 2 open-ended questions, and we look into that open-ended questions. And one of the questions we asked people who did the survey is that what other attributes or characteristics you think perhaps is missing in our survey, and one of the things is about sense of belonging. And I just thought that at this moment, and given the pandemic, I think that can be a really key impact and the key issues, because as Freddie said, the students, they don't know each other. So in terms of the social sense of belonging, so students feel they belong to the university, they belong to this module, they belong to this particular department, the class. I think that might be missing, and how that might have actually had certain impact on students' learning experience, and maybe also contributes to how their ideal student perceptions evolved over time because of this. So I think that is something that we probably want to find out. And I think we are kind of sketching some ideas in terms of what might be the further research for us. And I think the pandemic kind of these elements might actually play a part in terms of how students perceive themselves and what they perceive, what it means to be a university student. Yeah, at this moment.
Great. I'm going to ask one final question really quickly, because I'm aware that we've got so little time left. there's been an interesting one that's come in from Rosemary about whether or not you can do it around sort of specific disciplines, or if you can look at sort of cross-disciplinary. I mean, I think there's definitely a trend towards doing more interdisciplinary stuff, but it'd be interesting to see if you think identity around subject means that it needs to be more specific, or if it can be broad.
Absolutely, and that is definitely something we would like to explore more. Not just discipline, but maybe even degree programs, because when we do these activities, it's mostly within a specific degree program context, which I think is a great practical way. So, you know, when Freddie was doing it for his undergraduate, and also their colleagues in biology, is focusing on a particular degree program, because that's the most relevant. And of course, you could look at it in a broader sense, you know, look at the natural sciences or the applied sciences, but there will certainly be differences and variations between programs within a particular broad discipline. So I do think that there is a lot of value to make sure that what staff and students think in terms of what they expect in students are open, explicit, and discussed in a very transparent way. And it may even change over time, as Tiffany alluded earlier on. You know, the first years and second years and final years, we do have different type of expectations, usually more expectations the higher up you go. And that needs to be revisited. So what we expect in first years, we may be more empathetic for year one students, especially in pandemic. By the time they reach year 3, for example, we may be slightly different in terms of our expectations. But I'm just going to stop here now and pass on to Tiff.
Okay. Yep. I probably don't have that much to add, but yeah, I think in terms of the, you know, expectations across year groups and the students who have gone through this pandemic, and then most of their learning or provisions actually have done online. I think we certainly, I think my colleagues and I think we have this informal chat, and then we do feel we kind of worried when we are able to back to campus, then what does that might mean? And students actually probably expect more, because during the pandemic, I think all the colleagues, I think they work kind of around the clock. I think just a lot of work put into to support the students socially and academically. And in the second year, as we are going kind of continue to nurture students' independent learning identity, how does that might look like? Because then we are gonna take out our support and say, you know, now you know how the system works. Go and you know you need to develop yourself. But students might say, oh, in the first year I got lots of support, but for some reason in the second year and the third year it's all gone. So I suppose this transition and support the student with that transition, I mean, not just transition, but I think it's a progression from the year 1, year 2, and also the year 2 to year 3. So we think that might be issues that we can have another chat or discussions at another time.
Hi, sorry, I'm going to step back in now just because I'm keeping an eye on the time and I'm aware it's 2 o'clock, and probably a number of the people that are attending the launch have other meetings to get to. But I just wanted to say thank you once again to all of our panel, and congratulations again to Billy and Tiffany on the publication of such a fascinating book. It's been such a really interesting session today. I personally really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody has that's attended. I've popped the link to the book in the chat and also information code in case anybody would like to read the book. Hopefully you will. Do feel free to get hold of your copy, and we would love to hear what you think. So do get in touch with us. I'm going to circulate the recording to everybody that's registered in the next couple of days, and also to everybody on our panel. So do feel free to share that further if you'd like to. And thank you once again to everyone that's taken the time to attend today as well, and to my colleagues who've helped organise the event. So thank you once again, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Yeah,
thank you, Emily,
Thanks,
Freddie, and then the Bryony. Bye.
Bye.